Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 743rd New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Alvin Hall and Charlie Schultz. We are thrilled to welcome poet Jenny Liou here to close today's program. The Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we're speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Alvin Hall is an award-winning broadcaster, best-selling author, and financial educator. Alvin created, produced, and hosted the podcast series Driving the Green Book, which in 2021 received an Ambie Award and a New York Festival's Gold Award. He has authored a number of best-selling books, and his work in radio includes The Green Book and Alvin Hall Goes Back to School, among others. He's also appeared on the NPR's Moth. And our host today, Charlie Schultz, is managing editor at the Brooklyn Rail and is a writer and editor himself. And I'm so excited to have you both here in the Zoom room with us today, and I'll pass it over to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Eleanor. And I'm really happy to welcome you back, Alvin. It's our second time getting to speak on the New Social Environment. The first time was when you were the guest critic back in February of 2020, just before we all went into pandemic mode.
I remember that. In fact, I was just looking back at those essays. The subject, as I remember, was death.
That's right. It was the death issue.
And it's somehow, looking back at it, those essays by everyone seem terribly prescient about the issues that came out during the pandemic.
You know, I felt the same way. I felt the sort of prescience and the foresight that came together. You know, in hindsight, it made the piece feel a little bit prophetic, which is something that I think is only able to see when you're looking back. Otherwise, it's hopeful or pessimism. But you know, to have you here today to talk about the Green Book, I felt a completely different sensibility than the death issue. I felt a sense of hopefulness, a sense of rejuvenation, even a sense of a forward movement, and still thinking about the future. I'm going to hold it up so that everybody can see this fantastic object, and the title, Driving the Green Book, a road trip through the living history of Black resistance. And I thought about that title. Actually a lot. And mostly driving, and of course the story is part road trip, and the story has a lot to do with automobiles and how Black automobile drivers maneuvered through the country. But I also thought driving the Green Book, driving could be, it could be the idea of conveying or transporting something in a vehicle, and to me, this book is the vehicle. And what's being taken forward in this book is a very important collection of histories, really, a multiverse of histories that I think you have made into a vehicle that has the possibility to go into the future. And
thank you.
Yeah.
Quite amazed at that analysis. And it's something that I've only come to realize as a result of doing these interviews, that there is an optimism in this book. There is an understanding of how we as African Americans survived some very difficult times in America, how we were able to, even in these restrictive periods, develop and maintain and achieve part of the American dream for ourselves, and in essence, help America to deliver all of the promises of the American dream to every American citizen. And so I do feel the book is driving that forward. And the part that really excites me is also the fact that I wanted to see what were people doing with this information today. What were writers and artists and thinkers doing with the type of information that I found on the road? How were they keeping the spirit that represented Victor Hugo Green alive?
I couldn't agree with you more, Alvin. And there's so many things that you said that I want to pick up on, but I want to take 2 steps back because I want our audience to be aware of what the Green Book is. A big part of the story that you tell is how few people actually had heard of the Green Book, let alone knew what it was. Thank you, Eleanor. And so, yeah, here's a couple images. And Alvin, if you wouldn't mind, could you just talk a little bit about just what the Green Book, what it is that you found and made the center of this fantastic book?
Like most people, I didn't know about the Green Book at all. I discovered it when I was on a plane ride from the US to the UK. And as I always do, I buy a stack of magazines. And there was an article in a magazine, probably a sidebar, that mentioned the Green Book. I then came back to New York City and I discovered that it was created in 1936 by Victor Hugo Green and his wife, Alma. Victor was a postman in New Jersey, Hackensack to be specific. And during the summers, he and his wife would take trips south to Richmond to visit Alma's parents. And on the way there, they would encounter what he called aggravations. And then he talked to his other friends who travel around New England, and they also had experienced the same type of, quote, aggravations, unquote. And so Victor decided to create this publication so that when people were on the road, they could find businesses that would offer them the services that they want. And these businesses were really focused on African Americans. So he started out in the first issue in 1936, focused on New York, and then 37 New England. And then gradually starting in 1938, it rolled out across America, including every state, including the Caribbean, Canada, and by the end, Europe. The last edition was published in 1966-67, but at its heyday, it included listings by state, and then within states by cities, of all these types of businesses where Black people could find services and welcoming treatment, from hair salons, restaurants, as they call them, eateries, tourist homes, you name it, the full panoply were there.
That's so amazing. And so our audience knows this book. First, you did, when you first discovered this, first you made a podcast, and the podcast had its own realm of success and reached its own audience. What inspired you to go from the podcast to the book? What didn't you feel you had achieved in the podcast that you felt you could with the book?
I created the podcast with my producer, Jeremy Grange, who lives in Wales. So the BBC actually commissioned the program, and then the podcast came after that. When Jeremy and I did the program for the BBC, it never aired in America. It aired everywhere else in the world, but not America. And having done that road trip from my past, we started in Tallahassee, into the present, at the time, Ferguson, Missouri, following the killing of Michael Brown, I knew there was more to this story. We did that story for the BBC, the whole production, in 5 days. And I kept saying, there's more out there about the Green Book. And then I happened to be in the Museum of Modern Art for a show about Jacob Lawrence dealing with the Great Migration. And in that show, at the very beginning, they had an infographic. And in it, it showed how the population of various cities north had changed. And the one that stood out for me was Detroit. In 1910, the African-American population of Detroit was 1.2% of the total. By 1970, it was over 43% of the total, the largest increase in any city in that listing. That led me to look more in depth at Victor Green's creation and determined that all of these people who moved to Detroit had to come from the southern states, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, the Florida Panhandle, and Louisiana. So not only were they going north, but they were also returning home to visit relatives, and their relatives down south were going up to visit them. And while they were on these road trips, they would need something. So they would know where to buy gas, where they might be able to sleep if they could find a hotel that would allow them, where they could get emergency services if needed. And that led me to create the podcast, which was the drive from Detroit to New Orleans, following the routes that many people who were going from the South north or from the north south would have followed.
It's tremendous. It's tremendous. And in reading it, I feel that there is still more. I feel that you captured a big piece of history here, but I feel like, and in the end, when you talk about all the legacy and how it's being carried on, it's just such a rich history. And one of the things that you make so clear is how undersung it is. And that, that makes me realize how much more there is to tell. But one of the things that fascinated me about the book, is the structure. A road trip is probably the most classic American trope for a novel. It is, and most of them are chronological. They start in position A and they end in position B, and the journey and the adventure is getting from A to B. What I really liked about your book is that the chapters don't move in a chronological fashion like that. It is much more reflective and meditative. And I was curious how you came to that structure, because I feel it works really well. And it's not what I would have anticipated.
Charlie, I started this trip thinking I was going to do exactly what you said. Create a road trip following city to city, Detroit to Columbus, Columbus to Cincinnati, Cincinnati to Louisville, Louisville to Selma, right? That's what we thought. But one of the things I learned from many, many years of doing interviews for my BBC program is that I need to be always fully present during an interview. So I had a rule that on this trip, we could have no questions written down on a sheet of paper in front of us. We had to also listen to what the interviews were saying and then let our questions come out of their statements organically. Charlie, that decision brought some amazing gifts. People would say, you may not have time for this right now, but let me tell you this story. We always had time. Or we'd be asking another question and we would spark another memory, and they would share something that they had not talked about in years. When I finished this 2,021-mile drive from Detroit to New Orleans, and I was listening to the interviews, I realized that I had something greater, that I had the voices of these people. I had their lived experiences, and I had their humor, their sense of irony, and their generosity. What they had given me was their experiences. They had given me their wisdom. And I was certain that they wanted me to find a way to share this with other people who had not lived through Green Book times, who did not know about the publication, or who had just learned about it from the movie. And so I shaped the book around these themes, a chapter called Little Harlems, in which we look at Walnut Street in Louisville, Jefferson Street in Nashville, Ferris Street in Jackson, Mississippi. We look at the elders, the people who actually did the road trips and talked about their experiences on the road and how they connected their experience to contemporary events. We didn't have to ask them, what did you think of contemporary events? They would often pause and say, and when I saw this covered in the newspaper, and then they would start another story telling me something that was related to that event that they had experienced. And that shaped the book in the end. My editor also was incredible in that she encouraged me to add in my own personal story and personal reflections throughout. I did that. And sometimes when I read the book, I must tell you, it's exactly what I was thinking when I was doing the interview, when I was writing about the interview. Those are exactly my thoughts. And I find it deeply personal.
I'm so inspired to hear that. That's really one of the driving aspects of the Rail is this one-to-one communication and how community develops out of meaningful conversations and meaning conversations that have depth of character and attention, listening. Time and time again in the book, people tell you a story that makes you or triggers something from Janie, your companion, like you were alluding to with the interviewers, things that memories you weren't prepared to experience, and they would come up through the sound of someone's voice or all kinds of different triggers. Yes. What was that like? You talk about how at times it brings you to tears, but
well, to be honest, it brings me to tears now. One of the things about parts of this podcast and parts of the book is that I've never been able to find a comfortable place for some of these memories. Two particular come to mind. When I met Frank Figgers, Figgers, in Jackson, Mississippi, and he started talking about his life. And I struggled during that interview. He was talking about how as a young man, he had gone to this hotel where the Motown Revue was playing, and then was talking about his wife. But his cadence, his tone of voice was almost a duplicate of my uncle's sons growing up. That sort of deliberate, slow way of speaking that's always about making sure you're listening and making sure you get the message. It's quite intentional. And I had to leave that interview because I started to sob because I couldn't not see my uncle's son. Yeah. I couldn't see him. I couldn't avoid seeing him in everything Frank did. And so that was a really difficult moment for me. The other one was, and I sometimes read this passage when I talk about the book, is Hank Sanders in Selma, Alabama. He had walked with Dr. King. And during that march from Selma, Dr. King would say, "How long?" And the crowd would say, "Not long." Dr. King would say, "How long?" And the crowd would say, "Not long." I asked Hank Sanders, if Martin Luther King were alive today, what would you say? And he said, "I'd say to Dr. King, I did not know that you were talking about biblical years." And then he paused and said, "I underestimated the depth of white supremacy in this country. But if Dr. King was willing to give his life for this cause, I'm willing to fight on till the end." And that reminded me of an old spiritual that I grew up with. I'm going to fight on to see what the end's going to be. And then Mama, now she's too old, but she's going to stand on the side and she's going to lend her voice to the fight. And I always imagined that that's what he was doing. He was still there, still lending his voice. So those moments really connected deeply to my past, people that I knew, and the community that I grew up in. And so those were difficult moments, but I was determined to get the message. And then as I was writing the book, determined to share that message.
I think having Hank's words and having the words of so many people, it does that. It feels like many voices curated by your voice, and it's not cacophonious in any way. It unspools in a gripping fashion. I made a note at some point about how the structure and the formal characteristics of your book made the reading effortless. I moved from one sentence to the next sentence without trying. It was just so fluid. And yet the content and the stories that you told, and as you reflected on these stories that you told, that choked me up and slowed me down. And I found the experience of reading the book to be kind of bivalent in this way, insofar as your work and your editor's work made it an easy read. The content of what you've done here made it a difficult read, and that tension, I think, is it's remarkable. I'm not sure I can name another book that achieves it so succinctly.
Well, I think what enabled me to do this was, and this is an interesting thing to talk about, Charlie, because I've actually never talked about this. So I only write in the mornings. I can't write in the afternoons at all. And often I start at 5:30 in the morning. And if I hit a bad patch when writing, I'll go through my collection of CDs or my collection of albums, and I'll find some gospel music that I listened to in my childhood. And that becomes my inspiration. And I have a certain predilection for a very deliberate song that builds. And I know this. For example, there's a song called Just a Little While to Stay Here. Sorry. And that song means so much to me. And I would listen to it. And then I would calm down. And with that song in me, I would write. And that's what you see in the book. Sorry.
I feel it, Alvin. It comes through. Storytelling is one of the most powerful ways that we as humans share, care for one another, take advantage of one another. The power of storytelling is, it's biblical. It goes beyond this moment, and it's what we have. And the stories that you've put together, they're just so powerful, and it makes me happy. It makes me happy that there's a film coming. It makes me happy that the book is here. It makes me, as much as there is in the book to bring me sadness, I was watching the Biden State of the Union address, as probably as many of us were last night, and in discussing the murder, Biden talks about the conversation, the talk, Black families needing to have the talk with their children about how they act when pulled over by police. You have the same thing in this, and I was listening, as I was listening to Biden, I was thinking to myself, like, Alvin and the president, they're saying the same story right now. And the story wouldn't need to be said so loudly if white supremacy, even a different kind of supremacy, an authoritative supremacy, but supremacy nonetheless, hadn't reemerged in this moment so viciously.
It's shocking. It's shocking. And you find that people today see this. Some people see it as something new, but for African Americans, we see it as a variation on an old theme, sometimes more subtle and insidious than in the past. But I think what I also see are artists and writers attempting to deal with this in different ways. And in the book, chapter 10, I look at contemporary artists. I look at Tony Bingham down in Birmingham, an artist, a photographer dealing with this subject. I look at Jonathan Kalm, a photographer at Stanford University who's dealing with this. And I look at Derek Adams, who has built a career around looking at Black happiness and Black joy, and seeing the Green Book as a place where people not only found safe harbor, but they also found joy in being together with other Black people. And I think that's really important things to focus on, that the book, while we talk about the past, and I do talk a lot about that, and so do the people that I interview, but we try to end by looking forward. How will people be able to use this information in the future to motivate others to continue the fight, but also to find their own happiness and to help America become a much more generous and open country.
That's excellent. I want to show off the Derek Adams in the chapter 10, and this was a really inspiring moment. And I just want to read. I want to read a little bit from this. I've got it earmarked here. Adams reminds us of a meaning of the word sanctuary that's perhaps closer to Victor Green's original intent, a refuge. It is traveling for vacation and leisure, motoring safely to places where Black people could relax and have a good time, free, if only temporarily, of the restrictions of that time and the white gaze. This aspect is often overshadowed by the difficulties and traumas that the guide helped people avoid. Adams's deeper exploration of the guide provides an interesting parallel between his own practice and the less obvious aspects of the publication. You go on to discuss these less obvious aspects, and Derek in his work, about leisure, joy. At one point, we talk about, Derek talks about the danger of appearing leisurely, which was alarming. Would you talk about that a little bit?
I think people don't realize that Black leisure was very hard to achieve. So Blacks could not go to beaches and swim. There was a famous case in Florida where a guy and a group of people got beat up there. But then Black people discovered that they could create their own places of leisure away from the white gaze. So you had Idlewild, Michigan, Fox Lake, Indiana, Oak Bluffs in Massachusetts, and other places all around the country where Black people gathered and they had a great time. One of the people I interviewed, Charlie, during this trip was a wonderful woman, Mary Ellen Tyus, in Columbus, Ohio. And she had been, that's Mary Ellen there, and Mary Ellen was just wonderful in talking about her memories of growing up and going to Idlewild, Michigan every summer. Her grandmother had first started going there to deal with her asthma and loved it. And then they had a camp there, then they built a house there, and then they moved the house from one side of the lake to the other side of the lake. And she gave us this wonderful evocation of what life was like there, where you would go out and see singers that you knew. Della Reese, for example, would come there, and the Four Tops would come there. So this was a part of life where African Americans could be away from the prejudice and the limitations of society and find joy. And I think Derek's work really continues those themes and shows how it continues to expand in ways that give us great joy and represent achievements for us. And I love his work because his is such a distinct voice in contemporary art.
No, I so agree. And he drives the Green Book forward as well. He makes it a living part of his artwork, and his artwork brings it, rejuvenates it in another way, in another moment. It's great. It reminds me, it makes me think about another thing that I liked in the book was traveling in the car with Janie, and how you would ask each other questions to prompt conversation that I imagined as, in some sense, how you got to some of the ideas, just chatting with her about, and I put down a couple of these questions because I wanted to share them with our audience. I thought they were remarkable. Here's just a few. Is it possible for us today to feel what Black people feel, especially a Black family with children, how they felt traveling during segregation? What would be your worry if we had a flat tire or car trouble on a two-lane road in the 40s, 50s, or 60s? Imagine the sense of relief you would have if not one of the things you worried about occurred during your entire trip. I'll stop there because each one of these is such a launch pad to a conversation. How did those talks in the car with Janie, how did they evolve? Are they like I imagined, what would become the soil for the book?
Yes, they did. And the conversations would be, maybe we should ask this question of somebody that we were about to interview. So often we would say, I wonder what it was like. Maybe this person can tell us. And I remember we interviewed Mervyn Obisman in Louisville, Kentucky. And I have this story in the book. And he says, when you were on the road, you were so worried that somebody would come up behind you and annoy you. They would pull a gun and point it at you. You were driving down the road or run you off the road. You were so worried that when you arrived at your destination, you were relieved. You had to just lie down and rest. But then you knew that you had to do it all over again to go back home. So these ruminations in the car gave us questions often to ask people, have you experienced this? Do you have something related to this idea? And this opened us up to some amazing stories. One of the stories that still sort of haunts me is the one by Hezekiah Jackson about when he and his family, his mother, father, and 3 siblings drove north to Detroit because his mother's Aunt Beattie had died and they needed to go up there for the funeral. And while they were there, Beattie's family didn't have a car. So Hezekiah Jackson's father, wife, father, mother, and siblings all drove to the White family's house to pick up Aunt Beattie's last paycheck. And as they pulled up, the mother said, "Now don't tarry now." And as he got out of the car, it was like a miracle, not a miracle, an amazement that the police suddenly appeared. What are you doing up here, boy? You come up here to steal something? Right, where'd you get that nice car from? Do you steal that for some white people? You work for some white people? They're intimidating Hezekiah's father. The part of the story that really amazed me, and I think about this all the time, was how his brother reacted. His brother said, "Do you hear that white man calling daddy boy?" They respected their father so much. And in the community, he was respected so much that nobody would do this. So they had to watch their father be demeaned in this situation. The son, Hezekiah's brother, and all those children were collateral damage in this situation. You think about this today. How did that young man react to police authority afterwards? How did that change his relationship to police in general? Fast forward to today. Watching what happened to Tyree Nichols or George Floyd on television. What is the collateral damage today? This has stayed with me to the extent that I actually cannot watch those. The actual videos that are put on the media, I actually can't watch them because it always takes me back to that moment. Imagining that little boy, hearing his father treated that way and wondering how he processed that information.
Yeah. I just want to sit with that for a moment. That's a deep and moving thing to bear in mind. Trauma is what shapes so much of how we respond to one another and how we manage to work our way through life, how we respond and handle trauma. And it's the traumas that you chart are only matched by the resilience that you celebrate. And there's one piece in here. You don't use the word heartwarming, I think, more than once in this book, but it occurs once. And it occurs in a situation where you don't expect. And I'm sure there were many such situations where you had to be spontaneous and you are taken to somebody's home for dinner. You get to a hotel and you ask where you should go for dinner. The person it's in Nashville and the person invites you back to their home.
Anna
Exactly. Anna Nettles. I'm here with her on page 136. I just want to read this section too because I think it's fantastic writing. It's a good story, and it is a moment where it's a moment where it's recognized that all the difficulties and all the hardships, they sometimes lead to moments where a really beautiful thing can take place. This is one of those moments. When Janie and I left our hotel to drive to the address, it was dark and it was rainy. We had to drive very slowly down an unfamiliar street because we could barely see the addresses on the house. Eventually, we found the correct place. When we pulled into the driveway, Anna and her friend Crystal Churchwell Evans greeted us with umbrellas, towels, big welcoming smiles, and warm hugs. We had wine, delicious food, and a wide-ranging conversation, often funny conversation about our families' histories and our individual lives. Afterward, Janie and I imagined this was the way we would have been welcomed at one of the tourist houses listed in the Green Book after a long, perhaps unnerving drive on a stormy night through potentially unfriendly communities. The entire experience felt as if the fates had enabled us to relive some of the heartwarming history that the travel guide and word of mouth helped make possible.
Yes, that was a rich moment. And the picture of Anna there holding a picture of her grandfather, Willie. And another heartwarming story is about Willie, who had been in the Army, who had been thrown off buses after he's paid his fare in the middle of nowhere. In the last part of life, he decided he was tired of buying gas at service station, so he bought a Tesla. And even when his family told him that it was time for him to stop driving, he would drive his house from the Tesla down to the mailbox, turn around and drive back. And that sort of finding gratitude or finding optimism in something that's simple, and the generosity of not only Anna and her friend Crystal Churchwell, but also her aunt, Dr. Evelyn Nettles at Tennessee State University. That whole family, they shared so much about Willie and Willie's stories and their lives. That's the type of generosity I think that we found as African Americans when we came to these communities on the road. We may not have known the people personally when we arrived, but their welcoming embrace, they became our friends, they became our family that we needed when we were traveling.
Yeah. It's quite beautiful, Alvin.
Thank you.
I want to ask one more thing because it's right beside this. I've still got the book open, and I had made a note on this next page about networks. One of the things that surprised me was to find out about masonry in this history, and that could you just talk a little bit about the different networks, but especially how Black Masons interact in this period?
Yes, this was a revelation to me also. So I figured that from Black fraternities, sororities, Black people who taught home economics or phys ed or principles, I figured there were networks, but I did not know about the connection to the Masons. There were Black Masons groups and white Masons groups. But if you got stopped on the road, people would either wear their Mason ring or they have the symbol of the Mason attached to their license plate, or they'll have it someplace available. So if you were stopped by the police and you gave the sign or showed them that you were a Mason and they were a Mason, you would get leniency. And this extended also if you were in the courtroom, because a lady, Vernetta Shepard Pynchon in Detroit, told us a story about how by showing this ring or this insignia in a courtroom, people would recognize it, white people would recognize it, and they would be more lenient with you if you were a fellow Mason. So there was that understood brotherhood, not overt, but it brought some subtle benefits to many people. Dr. Noel Trent, who is Director of Interpretations and Education at the National Civil Rights Movement Museum in Memphis, also recalled a similar memory with her parents on the road. or her grandparents more accurately.
That's so, that itself seems like a whole other book for somebody to work on.
Yeah.
Like a totally fascinating history that does not have enough literature on it yet. Alvin, I feel we could talk and talk and talk, but I'm encouraged to get to our poet and our questions, and I really want to share with our audience the trailer for the film. Chloe, do we have an opportunity to screen that before we go to Q&A? I mean, oh. All right.
Do Americans know the Green Book? Do they know what it represents? How many lives did it potentially save? And most importantly, do we still need a Green Book today? The answers to these questions can be discovered on the road. Hence, the necessity of a journey driving the Green Book.
Congratulations, Alvin. I can't wait to see the movie. I'm so happy, and I hope everyone finds a copy of this book somewhere. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and I'm looking forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you. I'm sorry about my tears today, but there are parts of the book that still just live in me.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And thank you so much, Alvin. Please don't apologize for your tears. We are really grateful to have heard from you today. So thank you so much. And I'm also so excited for the film. Just started the podcast also. So everybody should check that out. There's a link in the chat for the podcast and the book. We do have a couple questions from the audience today. Our first question may be from our friend Yui.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Thank you so much, Eleanor and Alvin. Thank you. And tears are the beginning of liberation. So once we have them, my question is, was the Green Book, and I had heard this years ago, was the Green Book in any way inspired by or a parallel at the same time to the Jewish Vacation Guide, which cataloged where Jews would be safe and et cetera, especially at a time, of course, when anti-Semitism and the Klan was so rampant nationwide. Is there anything to that at all?
Yes. In the first issue of the Green Book, Victor has an essay, and he says that there has long been publications for Jewish people to find safe harbors when they are on the road. And this is built in that image, in essence. And there were guides for other people. So yes, I would say he was very much influenced by the existence of that. And he decided that African Americans needed the same sort of guide to maneuver racist America.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Great question, GE. Thank you. And we have another question from Jenny Liou, who's going to be reading poetry soon. But Jenny, you should go ahead and unmute.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Eleanor. My question, Alvin, is about Lovecraft Country, and I guess yeah, your sort of view of that whole project, and I guess a sort of bigger question of what it means to take on these stories if you're someone who sort of shares the positionality and some of the concerns out of which that emerged versus coming to it as an outsider. I guess also a question you touched on earlier about genre, right? Like, what is it that drives you into this sort of first person narrative approach? But yeah, I guess big question. What do you think about Lovecraft Country? How are you doing something that's very intentionally different?
When I first saw Lovecraft Country, I sat there absolutely amazed and so pleased and so happy. I am encouraging everybody who can learn about this material and use it in ways that makes people think about it, wonder where it comes from, and then starts them on their journey of discovery about the Green Book and how that image used in Lovecraft Country came about. How did that narrative come? I think that's really important. What young people and new creatives are doing in movies, art, plays, sculpture around this subject is really wonderful. My approach, which has evolved, really is trying to get in touch with the experience that I have lived and try to capture other people's experiences in their voices and to try to keep my voice simple within that context. I was raised in a very small community in the South, in the Florida Panhandle, and people told stories. And I can still remember so many of those stories and the wisdom that was built into them. So in writing this book, that was always my intention. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret too. So during the time I was writing this book, I was also writing a 650-word column for Waitrose Weekend magazine in the United Kingdom. It was called My Week. And I had to take something in my week and write about it. And 650 words are not a lot of words, right? So I had to get everything simple so that people could follow the narrative and get the impact in 650 words. I really do believe, having looked back at those columns I was writing at that time, that the required simplicity to get my story told in those columns really influenced what I was doing in this book. It helped me to realize it much more effectively. That I was doing about something that I was doing at that time for that column. This was something I was looking back on. Also, when I was writing the book, I went home to visit my babysitter, Dot Harris. From the time I was like 4 months old to the time I went off to college, Dot was my babysitter. And she was also my cousin. And so sitting on the front porch with Dot and working on the book and listening to her tell some of the stories, that simple rhythm of that small town in the South and the way people told stories and told them slowly played into how I structured the book.
Thank you, Jenny. That was such a great question. If anybody else would like to ask a question at all, please raise your hand or send a message in the chat. But I think our next and possibly final question will be from Fong.
I was running. Anyway, I heard most of it. Thank you. I can't wait to read the book in greater depth. And just following what G mentioned earlier on, based on the Jewish book, with the same different purpose, of course, but I just can't help, Alvin, but to think of, Louis Allen, the stage name of Alropo, Abel Moropo. I think he was a math teacher in the Bronx School, wrote the poem that became the song, of course, Strange Fruit, that made famous by Billie Holiday. And there was a cafe, I don't remember the exact, one of the first, integrated club in New York City. I think it's called Cafe Society, something like that.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I bring this up because there was a time when there were such solidarity between Jewish communities and Black communities because they were the marginalized, people. In your experience, I mean, have that ever, growing up, Alvin, have you came across such mutual sympathy and a sense of solidarity? I mean, we know what happened, that it stripped away, certainly some point in the 70s.
Absolutely. I was raised in a small town in the South where there were no Jews at all.
Yeah.
But yet when the school became much more open and Jewish teachers from Tallahassee, Florida started teaching in the school, some of the people who encouraged me the most, whether it was in my French classes or my history classes, were the Jewish teachers. And they were often, along with my Black teachers, the one who motivated me, who spent extra time with me, who encouraged me. They all knew that my parents were very poor and that we lived on this piece of land, and they all knew that. And they were actually some of the first teachers ever to actually come to our home.
Mm.
That was so unusual in those days for white people to come into the community where we live, but some of these teachers did. And that always stays with me, that they decided that they could come and just talk, and they want to talk to my mother and talk to me and talk to my brothers and sisters. And that act of generosity has always been important to me. And I think a lot of other people had that same experience.
Yeah, I mean, growing up in Vietnam, being a Buddhist in my upbringing, the first thing that we were taught was suffering. Suffering in order to understand anything, really, to have compassion on other people, to understand your own struggle as much as theirs, So without suffering, you can't really grow.
Yes.
You can't really think deeply and contemplate on deep subjects, of human affairs. So I felt that what we have gone through, however ugly, disastrously offensive, the sense of solidarity and compassion is the key.
Yes.
Is the key to overcome. And I think the book is very timely. So I'm very, very grateful. We all grateful that you took time and do this. It's a personal odyssey, really. Yeah, and I mean, I made my own pilgrimage in college to go all the way down to Mississippi through my own admiration of Delta Blues. I really want to know where it all started, So all of those, all this incursion, all this amazing adventure are essential. So I'm super grateful that you came and shared. And thank Charlie for being the moderator. And I'm just, I need to think about how later I can quiet a little bit too.
Okay, thank you.
I appreciate that you did during the course of the interview, the conversation there. Thank you, Alvin.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Eleanor. Sorry for my lateness.
It's all good. Thank you for that great question, Vaughn. We have one more question from the audience from Frank. Frank, you should be able to unmute if you'd like to ask a question.
Many thanks, and greetings from Brunswick, Maine, and Alvin and everybody at the Rail. Thank you so much for a wonderful program. Alvin, as a great lover of the visual arts, I know that you are always thinking of the artists whose work resonates with the issues, the subjects of our times. Were there particular artists, photographers, painters, printmakers, whose work you were reminded of during your travels and your research on this project?
There is no doubt, Frank. I was reminded of Jacob Lawrence's work, the Great Migration, some of the roads that we drove on, of that. Ramari Bearden's work around the same topic, Elizabeth Catlett's work on this subject. And then you have the modern artists that I mentioned in the book, such as Tony Bingham, Jonathan Calm, Derek Adams, writers like Jan Miles. But the visual arts, a lot of the people working during that 50s, 60s, capturing what was going on in the Black community and the sort of challenges that Black people faced, and how in some image you have the majestic Black person who is rising up, who is sustaining themselves. Those images often came to mind as I listened to the stories of about their family members, those portraits by all of these amazing artists of the Harlem Renaissance and after could have been pictures of their relatives. So I thought of many, many artists. Thank you, Frank.
Alvin, that's great. I look forward to follow-up conversations about a project I'm working on now about Gordon Parks coming to Maine in 1944, and
Yes.
really interested in thinking about the experience that he had in a place like Maine during World War II. But we'll talk about it further.
Yes, his images of the family in Harlem is riveting. The one he did for Life magazine, riveting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Frank. That was an excellent question. And thank you again to Alvin for all that you've shared. And thank you to Charlie for your fantastic questions and insights. We do have a tradition here at the Rail of closing our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate, Jenny Liou, to the stage. Jenny Liou is an English professor at Pierce College in Washington and a retired professional cage fighter. She received a BS in biology, MFA in poetry, and PhD in early modern literature at the University of California, Irvine. Her work has recently appeared in LitHub, High Country News, Lantern Review, and more. She is the author of Muscle Memory, a book of poems braiding her Chinese American diasporic past with her experiences fighting in the cage. And she is currently at work on a book-length collection of essays about immigrant ecologies. Thank you so much, Jenny, for being here.
Thanks for that introduction, Eleanor, and thank you so much, Alvin, for all that you've said. You got me scrambling to think about to think about the necessity of clear and complex storytelling, and so I'm going to read you all some little moments from my book that kind of deal with the unraveling of my family's very different stories. This is titled Our Bones. My father picks his mother's skull out of ashes, and we sort through the lesser bones while he writes on her urn. He's practiced weeks for this, hiding a fever, hiding a shaky hand. He wants us to mark this moment well. We're here to learn about our family, how the rice fields that were his are no one's now, the brothers he once had, marked with forgotten stones. I saw the great fires. I saw the sweat on his brow as he hefted her into the oven, then shut the door. Is this the closest we can come to love? Even the earth has no room for us, so we make each other small. Slouching toward. My grandfather's children found his military flight log after he died. No one seemed to want it, so I asked. An uncle said I wouldn't understand. I said my dad could translate, but they said he couldn't. He's the prodigal son, so they're shutting him out too. We go to a museum to search out a more public spectacle of suffering and find jade earrings. The progress of Chinese culture can be charted by the punctures made by jewelry, which correspond to what each civilization considered healable. Each earring is much larger than anything I'd forced through any part of my body, but I guess that's the whole idea. A foreign adornment narrowed to the sharpness of a pin, you let in even as it widens into the gyre of a history that isn't yours, but consumes you. Who will heal this? Figured I'd get one poem about fighting mixed in here, but it's still about my family. Shadow boxing. You know your life is fucked when you're on better terms with the person you just knocked out than you are with anyone who loves you. But that's what happened. I knocked her out, and then she hugged me, and then her father did. When I got home, I showed the video to mine. He loves Shaolin Kung Fu, believes the masters flew through groves of bamboo trees. I land a knee and then a flurry of fists. She crumples. He's disappointed. He says maybe if I practice, I'll learn better control. He says I should strike the air in front of her, but never her. He thinks you win by never touching anyone, and the deeper in I get, the less I disagree. When I was young, he'd grab my wrists and teach me to break free, saying, be like water, knowing, though I didn't yet, something of evil, some premonition of the ghosts I'd have to flee. This feels like a sprint to the end. Let's see. I guess I have a couple minutes left. I'm going to read you two more poems. They're all very short. I write very short poems, I'm realizing. I've brought home, this is called Sleepy in the Crook of an Arm. I've brought home this man my father converses with more easily than he has ever talked with me. Last night, my dad told him all about the war. My grandpa was a flying tiger, that much I knew. But now I overhear that when my grandma was pregnant with my dad, she was so sick one day that my grandpa's friend flew instead of him and fell out of the sky. My dad says he lights incense every year for the man who is the reason he was born into a father's arms, singled out already to be the one for whom the rest would sacrifice. When my grandma died, my father just said, "Don't embarrass me." We grew our hair, wore patches on our sleeves as emblems of grief. The chanting and bowing lasted a full month. I never learned the words, but I internalized the melody and postures, falling on the dirty floor over and over, hands down when you offer your service, hands up when you offer your heart. Johnny comes to bed after me. I curl toward him and sleep again, thinking love is a series of postures. When we rouse, my parents are stirring upstairs. The language I know best is one I don't speak, mysteries of phrases, misunderstandings of the truth. Weight shifts the floorboards. Someone is waking, someone preparing to leave. And I'm going to close with a short poem that is actually a loose translation of Li Po. My dad used to translate poems and talk about poems with his siblings, and they've all just slowly passed away. And so I guess I've inherited that conversation, and it's one of the things that binds us together now. A dream of wandering on Tianmu. Seafarers sometimes almost glimpse an eastern isle lost in the breakers and mist. Tianmu, the crown jewel of a mountain range, masses against the sky. My dreams are smaller, though. One evening, dreaming of home, I flew across the moon. I flew across its reflection mirrored in a lake, the ardors of my own voyage, entangling with myth. The shrill monkeys cried as I followed a stream to its source. The green waters glistened. All right, thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was so beautiful. So it was a really great way to close out this wonderful conversation. And thank you once again to Alvin and Charlie for the amazing talk. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can check out on our YouTube channel, and this conversation will also be posted there shortly. For the past 22 years, the Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics in our monthly publication and public events. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support all that we do here at the Rail. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Howardina Pendel, Adger Cowens, and the curatorial team behind Revisiting 5+1, which is on view at Stony Brook University. The conversation will be hosted by Elizabeth Yui and will conclude with a poetry reading by Portman Harjo. And you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. And thank you so much to all of you for being here today. Have a great evening.
Hello.
Thanks,
Hello, good
everyone.
boy.
Hey,
Thank
Andromeda
you.
Cluster.
Thank
you.
Thanks, Alvin.
Bye.
Thanks, Alvin.
Great poems, Jenny.
Charlie.
Thank you for reading those.
Thank you, Alvin. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Congratulations, Alvin.